Hello, everybody!
Turn this up in my headphones, Charles.
Turning it up. Hello, everybody, one and all. Welcome back to yet another very exciting episode of the Friends Talking Fantasy Podcast. My name is Charles, and with me today, as always, is my lifelong friend and co-host, Dylan.
I'm ready to talk some fantasy with my friend Charles.
I'm ready to talk some fantasy with my friend as well, Dylan, and not just any fantasy today, because today we are revisiting an author who we are very familiar with. We've read one of their series already. One of the first series we ever read was, Book of the Ancestor in the early days of
Book
FTF.
Of the
Huge fans of Mark Lawrence, and happy to say we're here to talk about his debut novel, Prince of Thorns.
Yes, his debut novel, the first novel by Mark Lawrence that you and I ever read as well. Mm-hmm. I believe, Charles, this is one that was way back. You read this, it's got to be a decade ago or something like that.
Yeah, I mean, the book came out in 2011. I'm sure, I was reading it not too far after there, maybe 2014, maybe? I don't know, but it was a long time ago.
Yeah, and I remember you reading it, and this was one that you right away were like, Dylan, you gotta get on this, you gotta read Prince of Thorns, and then it was my entry to Mark Lawrence's work as well, and I've never looked back. Read Book of the Ancestor, recently read his Impossible Times trilogy, which is amazing. Highly recommend that if you're a Stranger Things fan, by the way. And yeah. And anyway, huge fans of Mark and his work, so we're pumped to revisit something that we read way, way before, when we were just friends talking fantasy, and we weren't the Friends Talking Fantasy podcast.
Well said. We were just a couple of friends that like to talk about fantasy books. That's the extent of it. And this was one of our early ones. This is one of the early hits. I think this book gets, recommended a lot. I know I've recommended this book a lot. I made my dad read it a while back. I've given this book as gifts to people. It's just one of those ones that it just comes highly recommended from a lot of places. You search best fantasy books or something like that. It's always on the list. And, we're going to get into all the reasons why, but it truly is its own unique, piece of modern grimdark fantasy.
Yeah, for sure. It's way up there in any rankings of grimdark. It's oftentimes right up there with Joe Abercrombie's work, the first recommendation that people will give for grimdark, and that's because this book definitely gets into a lot of dark stuff, but I think even more than that, it's the nature of the protagonist, Jorg, who is just, a Machiavellian, pretty horrible person in what he does, and he's willing to do whatever it takes. I think the whole book, is Jorg, right? He carries the whole thing. It's a first-person point of view, and it's just all about him and the choices that he makes. So I think he's one of the most interesting protagonists in all of fantasy, and he sticks with me for his ruthlessness, his proactivity, his Machiavellianism.
I can't agree more. To me, the reason I recommend this book and love this book so much really boils down to the character of Jorg Ancraft. This character is incredible, and there's so many reasons why, but he's a horrible person, obviously, but the way he approaches things and the way he views life and the way he kind of strategizes is so unique, even in the world of fantasy, that I can't help but have some sort of respect for the game. I kind of imagine it where it's like in like D&D or another fantasy game where you can give points to different attributes. Like you get skill points and you can spread them out. I was always the guy that tried to spread them out as evenly as possible and get them as full as possible. But this is a character you just put like Machiavellian pragmatism all the way at the top and everything else down at the bottom. That's who Jorg is, and like what a character like that, when they commit to just whatever it takes to win, and you make that in a character personified, and you write this book in the first person, it takes it to the next level.
For sure. And I'll give the spoiler warning in just a bit, but one more thing before we get more into the deep dive of this. On the topic you were just talking about, Charles, with Jorg, I always think of him as a great example of something that Brandon Sanderson talks about, where Brandon Sanderson talks about when you're writing characters, that there's these 3 sliders that you can use, like 3 attribute sliders, almost along the lines of what you're talking about, like in a video game. And if you want people to, I guess, root for, or at least grow interested and attached to your characters in some way, you need to think about where they're placed along these lines. And the 3 attributes that he says, one is likability. We'll get to where Jorg falls on that one. Well, there's also proactivity and then competence. Those are the 3 sliders. And Jorg, he's such a compelling protagonist, even though all that likability is all the way on the bottom in terms of, is he someone that you would actually be interested in being friendly with or being friends with or anything like that? No, not at all. The guy is a horrible person, as we've said, but an extremely interesting character because you just max out that proactivity. So you need at least, you need something to make up for that. So you max out that proactivity, and you put competence pretty high too.
For sure.
And it just goes to show that you don't need a likable character as a protagonist to keep, I would say, most readers interested. There's certainly a lot of readers out there who, if the character is just not likable as their protagonist, they want some hero, and then this isn't a good fit for them. Sure. But I think most readers, if you pump up those other sliders, you can go as low as you want and likability and still make the character compelling.
That makes a lot of sense. That's well said. And it makes me think, it's like you got to respect Mark Lawrence for being able to be like, I'm going to tell, it's a relatively short story, especially for fantasy, first person, one POV, and I'm just going to make him extremely unlikable. And that's your whole story hinges on one character, and you make him incredibly unlikable, and it just works. Like, none of these characters are likable at all, but Jorg is a survivor, and you get to learn more about him through that first person narrative and how he kind of reacts to certain news and things like that before we get into spoilers. But the fact that you were like, let's make a whole book centered around a character and let's make him very unlikable is a bold move, and to achieve something as successful as Prince of Thorns from that is very impressive.
Totally agreed, Charles. Well, shall we get into this deeper dive at this point?
Let's get into it. I don't know if you need us to say read Prince of Thorns, but definitely check it out and check out Book of the Ancestor and check out all of his other work as well. You will not be disappointed.
Totally agreed. So, all right, if you haven't yet gotten the chance to read Prince of Thorns, and we are from here on out going to go no holds barred on the spoilers for this book. So now's a good time to turn this down in your headphones. I will say we won't get into anything from King of Thorns or Emperor of Thorns in this episode, so you don't have to worry about either of those. Though those books, by the way, are phenomenal, and I would say King of Thorns, Charles and I talk about this all the time. King of Thorns has one of my favorite endings of all time in fantasy. It's right up there. It might even be number one.
We bring it up all the time. We bring it up all the time. And the fact that these haven't been made into movies yet is an absolute crime, because that's a cinematic moment waiting to happen in all of the books, but particularly one scene in King of Thorns. So we anxiously await.
But we can't say what that is.
Nope.
Can't say what it is.
Just it's not this episode. You just have to read King of Thorns and find out. But the spoilers...
Right, read and find out.
Yeah, read and find out.
Raffo, as the kids are saying.
Oh, well done, sir.
Yeah.
So the spoiler ban has been lifted on Prince of Thorns. We can now jump into it. But, I mean, I still have so much to say about Jorg the character, because he's, it's a first-person book. It's small. It's all about him. One of the things that kind of fascinates me about him and the ways in which he is, like, air quote, likable, is he has this traumatic moment happen in his life that almost like Batman kind of, right? Where you watch your family die. His was a bit way more traumatic than that. But it's something that you can almost kind of get a glimmer of Jorg the kid that was traumatized, even though it never really gives you that. It never really lets up. There's plenty of times where Jorg is struggling with certain moments, acts of violence, like characters that he might like. He's like, oh, that's interesting that I might like this person. How odd. And just like keep moving on. It's a way to kind of root his character and I guess try and endear us to him. It works, but he's not an endearing character. He's not a likable character, but it still works.
Yeah, definitely. It's the moment where he's basically stuck in the thorn bush, where he has to just sit there and watch as his mom and his little brother are killed by an enemy king. I think that's there's a Raynar who's the enemy king. So he has to just sit there and deal with that, and it teaches Jorg this lesson where he's like, other people are willing to be ruthless, and if I want to survive in a world like this, then I guess I have to be too. And he takes that lesson way further than almost any other character that I could think of, at least in the protagonist role in fantasy. But he is someone who does not like to make the same mistake twice.
No.
He's out there doing whatever it takes.
Exactly. And whatever it takes boils down to even just like burning down whole villages, killing his own men that start to question him, all of these kinds of things. He does not care. And you get led on to that right away. This story kicks off with like a pretty violent beginning where he's, attacking people, and there's all kinds of horrible acts that him and his brothers commit, and that's just in the first chapter. And it's a really intense way to kick this book off.
Yeah, it should be noted that rape takes place in the first chapter of this. I know that's thrown a lot of people off of this book, and I think it's not as intense as some of what I've read in other fantasy novels that seem to have gotten less flack
for sure
for it.
Like Game of Thorns, for example.
Relatively, it's relatively off screen.
Yeah,
actually, or off, like more of a reference. But I think it's the fact that it takes place in the first chapter where there's just, you don't ease into it the way that Game of Thrones, before any of that seems to happen, you're pretty deep into it.
Right.
And anyway, so yeah, there's part of the reason why this is way up there on those grimdark rankings is that Mark Lawrence does not shy away from moments like that. And also probably that it's committed by the protagonist is also probably part of the reason why people have trouble some people have trouble dealing with it. So, I mean, everyone here has probably read the book if they're listening anyway, so they move through it. But it is something when I'm recommending the book, I think about it like a content warning type of thing.
Yes, certainly. It's kind of surprising, though. Like, when I remember picking this up again, and I haven't read it in years, right, since we were first talked about it a long time ago. And I was like, oh man, I remember the beginning being so intense. And I was like, wow, a lot of this is actually happening, like you said, off screen, like off focus, I didn't remember it that way. I remembered it being much more intense, and it still was intense, but I think it just speaks to like how unexpected a lot of these moments hit you in this book in particular, right in the first couple pages with your protagonist, that you're like, oh geez, this is pretty hardcore compared to like something like Game of Thrones or even First Law that goes into way more detail, but much later on after you've already kind of like gotten to know these characters, like, no, this is just like no other context needed. Jorg's a evil guy who does evil things, and here's some evil stuff he's doing right now. He's lighting people on fire. It's crazy, but it just makes it that much more impactful, even if he doesn't go into like the gritty details of it.
Yeah, and I would say too that this is part of what I even think of as the grimdark revolution that took place around, like the Blade itself came out 2006, and then there's this period of time where just a lot of these books started moving toward more of this grimdark area and more of morally gray, or in Jorg's case, he's not even really gray, he's just clearly a bad person, but toward these protagonists that are willing to do things like that, and maybe moving away from some of those Wheel of Time style protagonists that are always going to do the right thing in the end. So I think it's also jarring in its place in 2011, you said, Charles.
Yeah.
And it's almost a little different looking back on it now that grimdark had such a big presence for a long time. I do think, as we've talked about before, we're almost moving back around and what's going on in fantasy toward like a balance of these dark elements with some more, I guess, hope or heroism. We just talked about John Gwynn's work, and that's someone who comes to mind at finding a balance. And I think a lot of Mark Lawrence's later stuff finds a really great balance, like Book of the Ancestor and stuff too. So
yeah, this book you can tell right away is very clearly trying to make a statement, and like you can be like pragmatic through the roof on the slider, and what would that really be like? There's an appetite for these grimdark characters, but what if there was one who just put his pragmatism to work? He's like, I don't need to fully understand it. I don't need to care about it. I don't have to worry about being deceitful or dishonest or my reputation or the people I care about. I don't have to worry about any of that. If I was totally removed from any of these restrictions, what could I be capable of? What could I achieve? And it's really fascinating to watch him just plow through people, kings, armies against crazy odds because of that detachment. And that was, to me, the most interesting part of reading these books is how he faces these decisions and what he chooses to do to not only survive but to win. And that's like a huge part of this book.
Yeah. And it should be noted, we're talking all about Jorg. He's going to go get what he wants, and we haven't mentioned a lot about what it is he does want in this book. So some of it is what he wants revenge, vengeance for the death of his little brother and for the death of his mom. But also he wants to be king, and even furthermore, he wants to be emperor eventually. And he's 13 years old, which is kind of hard to believe in this book. Yeah. And he, at one point, he says, he references this toward the end of the book. He says, I told Bovid Tor that by 15 I'd be king. He said, I told him over his steaming guts. I'm telling you that by 20 I'll be emperor. Be thankful it's just being told over this page. So that's the kind of guy that we're dealing with when it comes to Jorg. And he wants power really badly because he knows what it's like to be powerless.
Absolutely. One of my favorite quotes from this book, there's a couple really popular ones, and this is one of them. But to me, it's just a shining example of that maxed out pragmatism that we're talking about. It's the one that relates to chess. And he's like, "You can only win the game when you understand that it is a game. Let a man play chess and tell him that every pawn is his friend. Let him think both bishops holy. Let him remember happy days in the shadows of his castles. Let him love his queens. Watch him lose them all." Which is like, wow, what a great way to quickly... And that's kind of early on in the book, too, where he says that. And it's like, I get this character. He's like, Jorg's the kind of guy who would win a chess match by just clearing the table and shooting the guy with the crossbow. Okay, he doesn't have to actually know how to play chess. He's just like, I'll just kill the guy and then I'll get the trophy. That's just kind of how this guy works. But it's this idea of like emotional attachment or compassion or any of those things is what's holding you back from achieving. And it's like achieve at any cost and revenge at any cost. And you don't really get too much in this book about how that affects him personally in his relationships. You see some of the cracks come in towards the end where he finds himself liking certain characters, and he starts breaking down into laughing fits sometimes, or he can't even face his own father without getting nervous. Like, the cracks that do come through are pretty understated, but they're super fascinating. And I think now that we've read and discussed a lot of books from a literary standpoint in the past 2 years, to go back and read this book from that lens and to try and read more into some of those moments was a lot of fun, because Lawrence doesn't give it to you that obviously. He's just, because he's so committed to Jorg's perspective, that only when the fact that he's in the room with his father and he's feeling intimidated and he's kind of getting a little flustered, the fact that he has that weird connection with his family, and then it just goes beyond that to his relationships with women and his relationships with his brothers that he actually does like, and why he saves the Nubin and all that kind of stuff, are really fascinating choices.
Well, yeah, and then eventually he doesn't save the Nubin. In fact, he kills him. Right? So,
but it was kind of different than from when he kills his other brothers. There's a bit of a mutual understanding there when that scene happened.
Yeah.
And,
or at least Jorg, it's all from the horse's mouth with Jorg here. So, I mean, I don't think people usually think of Prince of Thorns as being an unreliable narration in the way that they think of it with something like the Kingkiller Chronicle. Yeah. But I do think it's worth noting that this is all first person point of view coming from Jorg's mouth. Mm-hmm. So when he's giving these moments and then the Nubin just gave me a look and I knew he understood that I had to shoot him with a crossbow.
But then he goes and fights little Reiki too, which he would have done if he didn't actually at some level feel some kind of emotion for the Nubin, right? He strikes.
Oh, he does.
He picks a fight with little Reiki. He's like, if I was more practical like I usually am, I never would have done that, but here we are. So those kind of moments happened. But like you're saying, Dylan, it's not real moments of compassion or anything like that. It's as much as compassion as we're going to get from Jorg is, he gave me a look before I shot him with a crossbow. It's that's as good as you're probably going to get from Jorg here.
Right. He has moments too. He kind of has a soft spot for Catherine, who is... Catherine is the sister of his father's new wife. I probably could have aunt.
His step
is that
aunt?
The simpler way to say it? Yes, step aunt. I don't know why I went that roundabout route to get there, but yeah, Catherine is his step aunt. It seems like he's this 13-year-old teenager. He's kind of got a crush on her, and he does show he's willing to knock her out. Which is, it's funny because the Jorg sympathy is, and then after I knocked her out, I didn't kill her because I
wow,
that is
a huge declaration of love from Jorg.
Exactly, which is so funny because it does come from this place. When I remember when I first read it, I was like, oh, okay, he's falling for this Catherine woman, and she's gonna warm up his cold, dead heart and just thaw it out there. And it's like, no, no. He's just gonna knock her out if it comes to that and kind of think about killing her, but decide, I don't have to. And that's, like you said, that is about the best you're gonna get from Jorg when it comes to his sympathy for people. So
exactly.
It's
and
what we're dealing with.
He did also, another one of my favorite scenes was when he rescued the Nubin in the first place, which you could kind of read as another one of Jorg's moment of compassion, where he's, the Nubin's being tortured, and there's this whole thing of like, for some reason, there's something that Jorg is vibing on, and he's talking to him, and he's like, something about needing hard men or something like that, or like, can you do this and that? And he's like, yes, I can do all that. And then he just unclips his shackles and is like, show me. And the Nubin does not hesitate, and right away kills the captor and helps orchestrate the escape and all of that. And it's like these little moments of, with Jorg, you have to call them compassion, even though they're not really, like, makes this, are some of the more entertaining parts of the book.
Yeah. And his closest confidant, and I don't really want to say friend. I don't know if Jorg's capable of having
everything
friends,
we're saying here is relative to Jorg's perspective, okay? So when we say friend, we mean guy, that you don't, like, you would maybe give a look at before killing. That's a friend.
Well, that's exactly where I'm going with it, because it's Macon, right?
Yeah.
Like, that's a guy who's been with Jorg and protecting him. He's a knight. He actually has a little bit of honor, considering he's running around with Jorg's band of brothers who are just mostly just horrible people. But there's a moment where Jorg pretty much starts to see Macon as a liability, and he's like, all right, I guess I just have to kill him now. And he hesitates for just a second. And he's so mad at himself for that moment, too, where he's like, like, if I was really, like, ruthless to the point I want to be, then I wouldn't have hesitated in that moment. I would have just killed him, and it really cost me.
Right.
Which is...
Because, and that also speaks to more of Jorg's character, where he's like, the fact that he kills Macon also is like, why does he do that? And he's said before something along the lines of...
Well, he doesn't, but he tries to.
He tries to, but he goes, anything that you can't sacrifice okay, here it is. Anything you cannot sacrifice pins you, makes you predictable, makes you weak. So part of Jorg's desire to kill Macon in that moment was he was mad at himself for feeling something that he then perceives as being weak. So this is a very psychologically damaged human being, where it's like, oh, I might feel compassion for this person. I should probably kill them because I need to be king, and I can't have these things around. I can't trust them, this, that, and the other. The things that makes Jorg kind of lose trust sometimes may be more linked to him starting to feel emotions than maybe that person's actual intent. And that was one of those cases.
Yeah, and that's a big thing with why he kind of wanted to kill Catherine. Like, he almost has this voice in his head that's going like, she's your weakness. You have to kill her. And I guess to Jorg's credit, in that moment, he's able to resist it. So, for what it's worth.
For what it's worth. And that's like the interesting duality that we get from him, even though he's a very, like, on the surface level, one-dimensional, kill everybody, whatever it takes to get to the top. But then there's the reasons why, right? His motivators. Sometimes he's almost acting out in panic because it's like, oh, I'm starting to feel emotion. I got to do something. I got to kill someone, stab something. Right. And then there's other times where he's like, oh, I kill you and I can get this thing. Okay, bye. Like that. Like there's the two different reasons why he does it, and the subtlety in that, it helps to build some character around what you could perceive potentially as one-dimensional, but there's actually a lot going on with Jorg underneath the surface. It's just he's so determined in his POV that you don't really get it.
Well said, Charles. And you do get these moments that I almost forgot about this side of Jorg until the reread is he's out there quoting philosophers.
Yeah.
And I always thought of him as almost, he's smart in a conniving way where he's capable of out-strategizing people and all that kind of stuff. But I guess I thought of him as a little less of a thinking man in terms of just from a philosophical perspective like that. Like he's quoting Nietzsche, and I think Plato gets a shout out at some point. Like, it's very interesting.
Yeah.
And we'll get into probably a little bit about as much as we can in Prince of Thorns, about the setting.
Yeah.
And how it's a fantasy book where Nietzsche is getting quoted. But
yeah,
it's...
that's
another really interesting part of this book.
It's a fascinating perspective, like you said. And I agree completely, because Jorg, he's got this thirst for knowledge, and he's surprisingly open-minded, which is another thing about Jorg that I can't believe I'm saying when he'll kill anyone and anything, but he is an open-minded guy when it comes to finding a means to his ends, right? He's the one who's reading these books that to a lot of people sound like nonsense, but he's discovering some secret weapon, and he has the intelligence to know, I don't really need to understand how it works, I know how to use it. And I think that parallels nicely into this conversation that we're having about going towards about setting, because one of the other things that I've always just respected about Mark Lawrence as an author beyond his characters, and this is across all of the books of his that I've read, is his settings. His settings are incredible, and I think a lot of it comes from his scientific background. Book of the Ancestor,
former rocket scientist, and PhD.
Book of the Ancestor has stuff to do like the setting
familiar.
at the beginning, because no spoilers, is very, very cold, and there's just a very small sliver where life is habitable because that's how the sun's positioned on the planet, and in this book is still largely a mystery, but you're getting these pieces together that they live in a almost post-apocalyptic society where technology used to exist, but it kind of reverted. And there's certain scenes where the explosion of 1,000 suns, and then that's these are buildings that scraped the skies and all these things. And I think Jorg's screaming at at just a security panel. But it's like, say the password. It's like, my password is divine right.
Password. Those are really funny moments.
It's like, what is it when something meets an immovable object? You have two binary creatures going at each other, and it's like, what kind of conversation is this?
Yeah, I think at one point he's like, he's trying to negotiate or tempt it. He's like, how long have you been stuck in there by yourself, spirit? And it's like, I have been alone without any visitors for X amount of years. And he's like, that must be a long time to be lonely. This is a computer. Like, this is an AI. It is not feeling loneliness, Jorg, but good effort.
But to your credit, he was able to get inside. He found a way.
He always, if there's one thing we know about Jorg, he finds a way. That's
that he does. I mean, he flew a flag of truce and then just killed the guy. In a sword fight, he just whipped out a crossbow and shot the guy in a duel. And that kind of stuff just continues. So I think eventually he got in. He used his sword or something to pry something open, and he electrocuted himself at one point, I think. But he's describing it as someone who has no idea what electricity is or any of that. And it's funny because he's like, these are weapons, and Little Reiki's like, where? I don't see any weapons. It's like, no, it's a container full of a very poisonous thing that we can use to kill our enemies. It's kind of where the mentality's at.
Yeah.
But super fascinating setting. This pseudo futuristic, post-apocalyptic kind of setting.
Right. And it kind of slowly unfolds that understanding of it, because you do figure out pretty quickly, okay, this has to be Earth. There's legitimate chess, there's the same philosophers, there's, I think, the the figure that is the main religious figure is now called Jesu.
Yeah, something like
Jesu, no longer Jesus, but named Jesu. But it's very clear that this is some sort of form, like version of Earth that used to have a lot of the same features as our Earth that we're used to.
Right.
And
there's this interesting
like this moment
prophecy,
where it's a huge...
right? Where it's like so many people died at once that they couldn't all like pass on, so they got stuck, and that's why we have necromancy. It's like that's kind of an intense scenario to postulate, Mark Lawrence.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to say too much about it because in the later books, a lot more stuff gets revealed, and some of this ends up making more sense. And some of it is, Mark taking creative license to tell a great story, which we always appreciate. So, yeah, it's a setting unlike any others. And I also appreciate that there's not this like surprise big reveal moment around it.
Right.
Like just kind of bits and
the world I've always lived
in.
It's just kind of like this playground of possibilities, right? Where it's like, oh, they really hated stairs. Like I'm going up this building that at one point scraped the sky. I'm talking to a panel. I found this weapon from the builders. It's like, oh, okay. Like this kind of like hidden little hidden loot around, like a video game, right? Where it's like you're playing Skyrim, like but occasionally it's like you found poisonous gas. Yeah, like Borderlands. Yeah.
It's kind of Borderlands, which I feel has that kind of like somewhat futuristic, but also somewhat like
completely backwards
post-apocalyptic feeling time. Yeah, it's which great game, by the way.
Fantastic game
for fans of Mark Lawrence's Prince of Thorns,
for sure. For sure.
Yeah. So, all right. Well, there's a lot of really awesome moments around Jorg's proactivity that I think are really worth talking about. You mentioned a few of them, like when he's fighting that duel, and it's against some legendary seeming fighter, and Jorg knows he's outmatched. He's this 13-year-old guy, and he basically just starts running away.
It wasn't his
and,
duel, right? It wasn't it. There was
It was supposed to be Macon,
right?
But I think he basically says to his dad, he's like, "Oh
yeah," he steps in.
Something where he
pushes like, the tree over, the jeweled tree to stop it.
It's like a glass tree or something. Yeah. So then he ends up just running out and is like pushing people in the crowd away, and these people just got hit by like glass shards, and they're like the biggest noble people of the court, and they're just all bleeding now because Jorg, who's come back, he's they still know he's the prince, but he's been gone for years, and he's come back, and he just smells awful. Like they offer him a shower, and he's like, "Nah, I'm good." And he just shows up with all these ruthless-looking people, and he's fighting this really honorable, legendary knight-type guy, and it's kind of a moment similar to, I don't know if this is kind of spoilery about Game of Thrones. We're talking season 1 or book 1 of Game of Thrones. And it's not a huge moment either, but it kind of reminds me of the moment where Bronn fights that other knight. It's really early on. You remember that?
Yeah. Bronn's got kind of those, I don't do the honorable thing, I do the thing to survive. There's some great comments on honor in Game of Thrones I won't get into because they're actual spoilers even if they're early on. But this idea that honor will get you killed kind of a thing, which is kind of what Jorg is preaching a lot.
Yeah. So, it was when Bronn was fighting that Knight of the Vale, and he's just totally does dishonorable stuff to win. And Jorg, in an even more dishonorable move than anything Bronn did, just runs through, pushing people aside until he's able to get a crossbow from the crowd. It's like a WWE match where he's like grabbing a sledgehammer from or like a metal chair. Totally unfair fight, and then he just shoots the guy with the crossbow. He's like, "I win."
Yeah. How else is a 13-year-old supposed to win? I suppose.
Yeah, he does what he has to do. So that one sticks out. There's also the moment that we've talked about this one a lot is the moment where his dad puts him in charge of that. I think they're like the forest guard or something of that nature.
Small band of veteran soldiers. Yeah,
right. He's supposed to take a castle with those troops, and when he first steps up to meet the captain, Charles, that's such a classic moment, right?
Right. Yeah, because it's just one of those classic like villain moments where he's just like anyone could die at any moment. If you say something just not quite right to Jorg, he'll stab you, and he did it a couple times leading up to that. And then he's like, "Who's in charge here?" And then he's asking questions, and he just kills the chief, pushes him off. He's like, "No, you're in charge." He points to someone else. It's like it's crazy, and he does those things even to his own men constantly. But it's just one of those. It's another one of those examples of Jorg kind of, you could say, cheating, being unfair, but he doesn't mind taking lives to make a point. It's something that would be horrible to most people, as we've said, but Jorg is a special case.
He's definitely a special case, Charles. He is a person who, like, just so single-minded too when he sets his mind to something. I do love in that moment. He's like, in that moment with the captain, he talks to him for a while.
Yes,
like that's part of what's really interesting about that scene is he talks to him for long enough where you're kind of getting to know this other character. And in a lot of other books, it's like, okay, this character is going to be an involved secondary character in this part of the story.
Right.
And it's just Jorg kind of feeling him out, and eventually he just gets sick of him and he realizes the guy might not be willing to just do anything for Jorg and head into certain death. And he's like, all right, then he's going to get certain death. And he turns to the next guy after he pushes the original captain, or he's like, all right, you're in charge now. And he's like, hey, you need to be willing to just charge in something that's certain death. That's what I need to know. And he's like, if not, like, you go the way of the other guy, and it's death anyway. So exactly. You might as well take the like small chance of survival. And yeah, he cows that guy into submission, and he's able to succeed with that troop. And it was supposed to be almost I don't know if it was a suicide mission per se that his dad was sending him on, but definitely an unlikely one where his dad
setting him up to fail.
You can see where, yeah. And we should talk about probably his dad is just as ruthless. That's where Jorg clearly got a lot of his personality.
Yeah, it's funny that how they hate each other so much that they have these traits that make them hate each other in common. Right? It's like, it just speaks to how messed up Jorg's brain has been wired that he can't get along with his dad at all, and they're trying to outdo each other, outmaneuver each other, get each other killed, like constantly, always scheming against each other.
Yeah, and there's almost this weird, there's hatred, but there's almost this weird respect underlying that. There are these moments where Jorg is like, I should have known that my dad would do this because he wants to get me killed. And
it's like, that was well played, can't hate.
Yeah.
Game
and
recognizes
his dad
game.
just stabs it.
Yeah, that's...
Yeah, game, respect, game. Eventually his dad just stabs it.
Which is exactly what Jorg has done to people
right?
constantly. It's like... Nothing like an what is it called? Where it's like an unwarranted stabbing, it's like that's their trademark move.
Yeah, the Ancraft signature move.
Right. Yeah, Jorg really didn't see it coming.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny too because he in his last moments he first of all, he tries to make a joke about it. I can't remember what the joke that comes to mind for him is, but he's like annoyed he can't like just get a last joke out.
Mm-hmm.
And then he is kind of like, I should have seen that coming.
Yeah. And it's fascinating that he didn't, and he kind of learned his lesson at that point. That was kind of the pushing point where it's like, okay, now it's me versus my dad kind of a thing. One of the things I wanted to pick your brain on, Dylan, since you have some psychology counsel training and background going on. there's this character aspect of Jorg that I find fascinating, where when he thinks he's about to die, he just goes into these laughing fits. It happens a few times, I noticed, in the book. Like when he feels like he's kind of been pushed into a corner, he just finds it hysterical. And, you know, if I was Jorg sitting on the therapy couch, you know, on that like Freudian sofa, lying down prone, looking up at the ceiling, being like, yeah, I almost died, and I just couldn't stop laughing. Like, why do you think that is? What is the connection there to him laughing in the face of certain death?
I mean, there's some degree of just hysteria, I think, and I do know of people who, during panic attacks anyway, I don't know if that I would call what was happening to Jorg panic attacks, but I know folks who, during panic attacks, have broke out into fits of laughing, which is, you know, within the range of a normal reaction there. And I'll also say the go-to usually when a client, in my experience in the therapist chair, the go-to is when a client's laughing when they're at least talking about really distressful events. We don't get into a lot of life or death level events in the therapy room like George was involved in, but when they're laughing about really distressing events, it's usually even if you ask them, hey, I noticed you were laughing and this sounded really distressing to me, a lot of times folks will pretty quickly say, yeah, I think it's a defense mechanism where I kind of am trying to lift myself up out of this. Mm-hmm. Jorg would be a very interesting case study, I'll say. I don't know how well we can apply our like the typical understanding of a psychological profile to Jorg, but there is it would be kind of interesting. There's something called the dark triad of personality traits that would be kind of interesting to look into from
I've heard of that
the perspective of Jorg. It's narcissism, Machiavellianism, and psychopathy. And there's Jorg is, I don't know how high he is on narcissism per se, certainly higher than most people.
I mean,
but not
he's willing to admit, he's willing to admit flaws, and he's open-minded when it comes to figuring stuff out, like trying to understand what happened. He's like, oh yeah, I messed up. Actually, I even found the quote of when his dad stabbed him, where he goes, I should have kept my eyes on him, should have remembered where I got my mean streak. So he's willing to relent a little bit.
Yeah. I don't think he has that much of a I think he has a actually somewhat realistic assessment of his abilities.
Yeah. He even goes, and what made my loss, my pain any more important than everyone else's? I mean, the fact that he even thinks that, even though none of his actions lead him to as someone who thinks that, but like he's the kind of guy that will think that and then continue to take lives on a whim, which is kind of fascinating. But he's like, it just is, I guess.
I think the other two, Machiavellianism is
off the charts.
The number one thing I talk about when I talk about Jorg. Yeah. It's Machiavellianism. It's named after Giovanni Machiavelli. I don't know if that's his first name, but it's the whole "the ends justifies the means" is the famous quote associated with that, and it's all about being able to manipulate people and being willing to do that in order to like achieve whatever ends you're trying to get to. Like it doesn't matter the process. What matters is where you get, and that's Jorg. To a T.
For sure.
And then psychopathy, that's more about the like callousness, antisociality, being remorseless about all these horrible things that he's doing. And
checks those boxes.
That is way up there as well for Jorg. So I think he'd be interesting to look at from that perspective. But yeah, he would be a very atypical case, Jorg. That's what makes him so interesting. And he reads as more believable than you would think based on the actions he takes.
Right.
And it is those glimmers of I don't even know if it's fair to call them glimmers of humanity. Like you said, it's relative to Jorg. It's those glimmers of doubt or humanity that show up that and of course the fact that he was so deeply traumatized, and the fact that like you can tell his dad is probably way up on the dark triad as well. Probably really high on narcissism too. His dad, I feel
and
like.
I also feel like the fact that he's 13 is another interesting aspect of it. You're not fully emotionally matured, and I think, you know, I see some of that in Jorg, where he doesn't quite understand what he's feeling sometimes. I mean, he's so far gone from anything that could be related to being 13. He's so broken, but there is that piece of it where you're kind of reminded sometimes. And even the very beginning of the book is like, oh, you're only a boy. You're just a boy. Meanwhile, he's like still kind of infatuated with like certain women, and he's feeling something and then not understanding it, so lashing out in some other way. Like, he's done that several times. It's kind of fascinating how you can parallel that to maybe a teenager going through stuff.
Yeah. I mean, this is the classic psych or neuro go-to here is like the frontal lobe is not fully developed, and it won't be for a long time for Jorg. Like in men, that's typically not until like even the mid-20s. And
he's going to be emperor by 20 according to the end of the book. But
yes, he'll be emperor or according to the end of the book, he intends on being emperor well before that frontal lobe is fully developed. So
great.
So and the frontal lobe is responsible for some of these more complex processes, and you know, the typical teenage impulsiveness is usually attributed to them not having such a fully developed frontal lobe. And Jorg is ridiculously impulsive. That is, you know, he decides in a moment, hey, I want to kill this, you know, road brother of mine, and he just does it. He decides in the moment he wants to push a guy off the cliff, he just does it. And that impulsiveness is definitely a characteristic of a teenager.
Sure.
Maybe think through it a little bit more if he were in his 20s, 30s.
Hard to think of him as a teenager. Sometimes I'm reading and I just picture like a late teens, early 20s figure in my head. And then I'm like, wait, he's 13. Like, that's so young. So young. Still. For that TV show or movie that you were saying it's criminal we haven't gotten yet, Charles, I do think I would want them to age up. I don't know, man.
Just because to visually, you think
if you're
so?
Like the
to
whole,
visually see a 13-year-old
right?
doing that would be...
Prince of Thorns is nothing if not shocking, dude. It's nothing if not provocative, pushing the limits, shocking. Like, that's what this whole character is about.
It'd be interesting to hear what Mark thinks about
you know who it kind of made me think of? Because I was thinking, like, gotta cast him right now.
Should they age him up?
You've seen Umbrella Academy, right? So the younger one that time travels.
Oh, five?
Yeah.
5?
Because he's young looking, but
what his actual name is. But that's a great...
Because he's young looking, but he's so mature in his performance that would be a good... That's like kind of like someone that I picture. He kind of fits the description too. But even that might still be too old. He's...
Yeah, but that's
he mentions he's an early
teenager
in that. Yeah, but I don't know, dude. I think there's something.
Aiden Gallagher,
okay,
is the name of that actor. He's phenomenal in that show.
Super talented. Super talented. How old is he? If you're on his page, just out of curiosity, like, is he in his teens or is he? Because he is like
played by Aiden Gallagher.
The maturity level.
How old is? In September, he turns 19.
Wow, okay, so...
He looks younger.
Yeah, I'm sure they put him in that, like, schoolboy outfit and everything and give him it definitely ages you down. But, yeah, only 18, so still a bit older than your 5 years.
Okay, he plays 5, I guess, in the first season is 13.
Oh,
and he pulls that off.
Yeah, when he was in the first season, that was many years 13. Ago.
Yeah.
So that checks out.
So, I mean, but, you know, if right now, if the Prince of Thorns TV show were to launch.
Or movie.
He'd probably be a great, or movie. I mean, make a great movie.
Yeah, I think so.
It's very reasonable size for doing that. It might even be a better fit for a movie than, 3 trilogy of movies, one for each book.
I think so. I think you watch it, it's shocking, action scenes happen, and you move on to the next story, the next part of the saga. You needed to move a little bit faster. But yeah, I mean, that's kind of the performance that I was thinking of. It's a shame we can't, instead of Umbrella Academy at the time, 5 years ago, we were casting Prince of Thorns. He would have been perfect. He still would be good. But I feel like the fact that he's 13 is something that I constantly forget. But from a visual standpoint would be incredibly shocking and uncomfortable too. Like there's scenes where he's with, he's with certain people and he's, reading books next to naked women and all that stuff. And a 13-year-old would be like, ew, icky. And then he's like infatuated with his step aunt, which would also be kind of weird when you're 13. It's like, this guy's kind of got a few wires crossed. But I don't know. I think it would add to that shock value of the whole thing.
It would definitely add to the shock value. I'm not sure if I'm personally ready for the 13-year-old visual media. Like, there's just something different in the book. And anyway, I'd bring him up to 16, 17 if you're asking.
Not an unreasonable thing.
Charles,
to do.
you will agree to disagree.
No, I would compromise on that just to get the thing made, but I'd be like, we need to be a little provocative here. This whole book is provocative. It's meant to...
I mean, still, if it's a teenager who's like under 18, that is pretty intense. I'm trying to think, too, of like Game of Thrones characters and how old they were supposed to be during...
Like in the books, they're way younger. That's another thing where they aged up the actors and the characters in the stories to be older because it's too young. So, like, I wouldn't blame.
Arya's like 9 when she's doing like some stuff that Maisie Williams was probably like 15 when she was doing.
Yeah, exactly.
So, Charles, something that always sticks out to me is very, very Prince of Thorns. It feels very Mark Lawrence writing style as well. Is the end of this book where I'm thinking of the moment where there's this mage who has basically been kind of doing some controlling of Jorg, and there's nothing using his magic powers. There's nothing Jorg hates more than feeling like he's the pawn instead of the player of the chess game. Right. So then he's really focused on taking out this mage. Corion is the guy's name. And there's this fight that they're having, and you think maybe Jorg is going to lose. And what ends up happening is Jorg gets kicked by a horse just in the mayhem of this big fight. And he knocks into Corian. And then Jorg is just quicker in reacting to this whole situation.
Breaks the concentration of the spell long enough for him to take a moment to attack. Yeah.
Right. And he stabs the guy, and it's like, there's a great line too where it's just like, it's over, Jorg. Goodbye. The mage has placed his knife for the final cut. And it's just like, new paragraph. You'd think there was never a good time to get kicked by a horse. So it's just great writing.
He knows how to write those hooks.
And, he does. And those first lines, that's always classic Mark Lawrence's amazing first lines. But anyway, he gets kicked by a horse, he stabs him, and then he like grabs his head and he's just holding it up like this big victory moment because Jorg does not care.
We're still acting like that head could attack them at any moment. They were afraid to do anything. And here's Jorg like slinging it around, like, I did this. It's like, whoa.
Yeah. So I just love that moment because it's something I think about all the time. It'd be interesting to talk to someone like Christian Cameron, who has a ridiculously great understanding of... that's Christian Cameron goes by Miles Cameron when he writes fantasy. That's like author of The Red Knight, Artifact Space, all that. And friend of the show. Wonderful dude. Check out Against All Gods. Recently released.
For sure.
So... it'd be interesting talking to him about something like just all the mayhem that probably happens in these medieval style fights. It just feels very realistic that kind of stuff would I think again of, not to crap on Wheel of Time, but just the moments always have to be so epic and heroic, and it's like, that's not probably how things played out most of the time in these medieval style fights. It's probably more this random chaos of getting kicked by a horse and somehow it benefits you.
Yeah, exactly. And it's also kind of like Jorg, the master of like Machiavellian planning strategy, will go into a skyscraper to get a crazy weapon to use, like, and all of that. The winning factor was him getting kicked by a horse by chance. There's something to be said there of like, even when he's not planning or doing anything, he still was able to get his moment and take advantage of it. Even when it came down to chance.
Yeah, for sure. I mean,
lucky guy.
It's it's the kind of thing that probably would be super common. So respect to, minus the mages. There's probably a little less magic going on. But
you think?
Yeah, and God, it's so tempting to want to talk about some of the other really interesting.
Oh, don't I know it?
That come later, and I know.
But I mean, we're circling around the hour, so up, what do you got?
I mean, I was thinking, we just talked about the end. Unless something really sticks out to you as a must talk about point that we haven't gotten across, I think I'm just about ready to tell people to go read King of Thorns if they haven't, because
I cut you off when you were so like,
I just gotta say there now. Yeah.
And then
oh yeah. I don't know what I was getting. I don't know what I had to say. No. Apparently, I did not gotta say it. But
lost the time.
King of Thorns, so good.
So good, people.
If you haven't read it yet, you're at the end of this episode. I can't recommend that one enough, because this is one of those series, Charles, and it is, I think, still relatively rare where you can make a case that it even gets better as it goes. I don't know. They're all, for me, kind of around the same level, which even that is very rare, I think, in a series to keep up the same quality. I think a lot of times the first book tends to be the best. And then even in great series, it's a little notch below the
I say books, like great moments permeate throughout the series. And it's a short series too, comparatively to other, all the books are relatively, I say short, but there's, short for fantasy books, and it reads fast. They're all great books. It's hard to say which one is better than the others.
Something I wanted to say? I did a lot of audio this time around.
Yeah,
and I didn't,
me too.
I didn't do that the first time I read it. And I'll say that the performance was incredible.
Very good.
And let me make sure I get
they capture
name of the narrator
that,
to
like,
give proper credit.
They capture that almost like the voice actor is very calm, but the performance also has this edge to it. It's like can't describe it, but it's really well done.
Yeah. James Clamp.
James?
Who I'm not familiar. I don't know, maybe he's done other work in the fantasy genre, but I'm not really familiar with what else he's done. We're so used to, there's a few names that we're super used to seeing all over the place in fantasy. There's, of course, Michael Kramer and Kate Redding, who've done a lot of Sanderson and Robert Jordan work.
Stephen Pacey does all the first
Stephen
law.
Pacey is a great... and then we've had other folks that we've seen around, like there's the same guy, Michael Page, does the Gentleman Bastard sequence, as well as doing Robert V.S. Reddick's awesome Catherine Voyage series. So, you see these kind of names that flow around a lot, and those people are all fantastic, but I was amazed by someone that I just hadn't heard anything by before, how good a job he did. So if you're looking to reread, which I imagine if you're listening this far, you have read the book already. If you read the physical copy like Charles and I did the first time around, give that audiobook a try. It's definitely great, and it goes so
it's like 7 hours, 8 hours, and
I think it's 9. I was just looking at it, but I mean, compared to we've listened to audiobooks of Wheel of Time getting a lot of shout outs.
40
today,
hours of
but
audiobook. Yeah. It's
I know.
like, and that's like the whole, Broken Empire trilogy isn't even that long, I don't think. So,
Yeah.
Pretty incredible. But, yep, definitely check it out. Any of Mark Lawrence's work, I would say. Dylan, holy smokes.
What?
Tomorrow is the publishing anniversary of Prince of Thorns, August 2nd, 2011. According to Wikipedia.
Really?
Look at us. It's tomorrow.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's just kismet.
Yep.
Kismet drop.
Nice vocab word. Yeah, 11 years. Because I remember last year they did the whole 10-year anniversary thing with the Grim Oak Press edition and all that of the book. So here we are.
Well, we were thinking about, before hiatus, weren't we thinking about doing this on...
It was one of the immediate
anniversary?
next episodes we were going to do before we went on hiatus. So now it's one of the immediate ones we do when we come back. But I'm looking at it right now, published on August 2nd, 2011. So there you go. I was like, wait, isn't that today?
It's almost tomorrow. A bummer we can't... Yeah. It's almost a bummer we couldn't drop it on.
Well, we can announce tomorrow that we'll release it on Monday. I'll tweet something about it tomorrow. We'll tweet something about it.
Yeah.
Because, that's a big deal. It almost, like, we did not plan. I'm only realizing that right now. It's very serendipitous, but we got close. So
nice. Serendipitous and Kismet getting dropped.
Ooh, yeah. I feel like Kismet is a rarer drop, though.
It's a deeper
cut.
It's a deeper cut. Yeah.
Well, there we go, guys. Prince of Thorns, Mark Lawrence, highly recommended.
Sorry. I just feel bad for the listeners. Just talking about how deep a cut Kismet
This is the end of the show, people. This is what the real hardcore listeners are waiting for. Are these moments where things start to break down a little bit? We're wrapping it up anyway. They could stop now, and they'd just be missing that sweet, sweet outro music. But all
right, well, let's get that sweet, sweet outro music pumping, Charles, before I distract us even more.
Allow me to play it. Here we go. Thank you all so much for listening to yet another very exciting episode of the Friends Talking Fantasy Podcast. If you like what you heard today, let us know over on social media at the FTF Podcast with the number 1 at the end on Twitter, and then the FTF Podcast, no 1 at the end, just the FTF Podcast on Instagram. And Dylan, I've heard that, you can now on Spotify, if you've liked the show and you listen to it and you've engaged on social media, you can go on Spotify and show some love.
You can toss 5 stars to our podcast on Spotify now. So it's super easy. It's just like at the top of the screen when you're on our page. And it helps us so much. Yes. If you do like this show, it's like 2 clicks away and right in front of you. And I'm pleading with you to give us a nice rating over there on Spotify. 50 to 60% of you listen on that platform.
That's right.
So,
can you believe how much market
you can help
share
us so
captured?
much.
It's over 50% of the listeners now. When we started, they were like 30.
Right.
But
when we first started, Apple was like 60%, and now they're down to, for us, like somewhere from like 10 to 20%. So
crazy.
Spotify has eaten Apple's lunch. So you're probably listening on Spotify. So if you can toss 5 stars, that is fantastic. But just listening is more than enough.
Guys. Thank you all so much for making it to the end. We really appreciate you listening. That's all you ever have to do. Thank you, thank you, thank you. And as always, go forth and conquer, friends.